So before all the various movies that have people turning into wolves, we had the original 1941 version with Universal. This will, of course, round out our discussion of their MonsterVerse, and then we'll be talking at the 2010 official remake. I'm John Chang, Dan Edmonds.
How? Yes. This is quite. Yeah, I mean, we've done quite an epic journey through the
Yeah.
Universal monsters, and it'll be quite nice to dot the I and cross the T on this one, and just say, okay, we've done them all now. So
Yes. So I think like an interesting question was, well, as we kind of discussed in other ways, it seems like the MonsterVerse is kind of a bust and stuff. But what would you say is like kind of something that Universal could salvage though out of all this? Like, what's like the future that you could that could really make sense or kind of would that we would want to see actually as an audience?
well, I think actually trying to make actual scary versions of the movies would be a
Okay.
good start. Well, because they a lot of them have tried to they've lost track of the fact that they're a horror movie, and they've tried to sort of
Yeah.
introduce romantic plots or kind of
Right.
more sort
Right.
of special effects and fighting and things like this. And I think that's kind of it would be nice just to them get back to what was the core
Mhm.
scary element of this, and actually sort of focus on that and try to, I don't know, you say reinvent it for a modern setting, but that nearly always goes wrong. It's kind of,
Yeah.
I think with these ones, there's such sort of gothic themes that it's actually almost better to try and do a historical setting, I think.
Mm. And I think what the Universal and I think in general, like kind of the different versions that we've seen, the confusion or whatever is that different times I think they see like where they latch on to that like it's the romantic elements that kind of makes it successful and stuff. And I don't know if that's necessarily true as we're kind of seeing, and we'll definitely talk more about. Certainly like we've talked about how love and kind of the doom and stuff like that is a little bit of like a key part of the DNA of these different ones. But is it something that needs to be highlighted other than like kind of that basically it's the maybe the baseline story and stuff like that? And yeah, I mean I think it seems like in some ways that the modern versions try to appeal to a broader audience or to a more action oriented audience, trying to maybe bring in the comic book hero type audience and stuff. But I think they end up diluting a lot of what really is another key core part about, like you said, which is the horror that like that was scary at the time, and maybe like nowadays it doesn't have the same effect on us, but it's something that like maybe what they can do, rather than like necessarily, like you said, bring it to a modern setting, but just to bring a modern sensibility to the horror and stuff.
I think so. I think just sort of interrogating what would actually be horrific and spending
Mm,
some thought. I mean, something like Frankenstein, having a few failed, experiments where the monster can't sort of deal with reality and does some, and you see some more of that. That's what I kind of liked about the 2015 one, was that you saw some of the sort of internal dialogue of his
mm,
thoughts and how he was trying to come to grips with it. I mean, it's in a funny sort of way. I really thought that was an interesting remake, but it's oddly, weirdly unentertaining in a way. But yeah, I think just a little more thought about what really is horrific about them,
yeah.
and try and sort of, and just asking more. I think that's the secret: asking more questions and just delving more into what would that actually be like. Yeah.
So, speaking of kind of more contemporary stuff, the 1941 version, the original, is actually was contemporary for its time and when they made it and stuff like that. They kind of put it into a more modern setting for 1941.
Mm,
It stars Lon Chaney Jr. and as kind of Larry, which is an
yeah.
interesting name for a horror figure, I guess, or monster to be.
Yeah.
And actually, like one kind of thing that I wanted to mention with him was there's actually a movie that like isn't really related to the Wolfman movie that they made years later called A Man of a Thousand Faces, which was a story of Lon Chaney himself. And the thing that he was fairly proud of was that what he kind of did to really bring out the Wolfman character, like or like kind of like he so it's actually not Lon Chaney Jr. Who's in the movie, but it's his dad that like who actually like kind of originally nated things and stuff like that. So it's kind of like an interesting kind of um, connection, I guess, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, what did Junior do to? Because he sounds more like a sort of a method actor rather than his dad, I guess. But
yeah, well, I mean, certainly, like he kind of made us like kind of like he kind of more or less brought the more tragic kind of elements to it stuff. I feel like, anyways, with this version, I don't know. There's something about like I think that's the kind of the interesting comparison between the modern remake and the classic or the original is that both actors, there's something about them that like really um, portray this kind of tragic figure. Like kind of like you get the sense that like they're like even before like kind of as things develop, whatever, you just have the sense that like they're doomed and stuff.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't seem too doomed. He seems quite sort of charming and affable in the beginning.
Initially,
in the
yeah.
1941 version. I think the other question I was going to ask you, your thoughts on why in 1941 did they want to try and resurrect a werewolf monster franchise? Because most of the other Universal monsters were in the 30s.
Right.
And this one seems quite sort of late and tacked on. Do you think it's almost a case that they were desperate to try and create some of that buzz and success and were just sort of decided, hey, let's redo this one and see how it goes?
Yeah, I didn't really come across anything that specifically, kind of tackled that question about timing of that and stuff. It did seem like kind of in some ways almost like the way we kind of progressed ourselves in terms of the viewing and stuff like that, where they covered these different monsters and stuff like that, and then like kind of the Wolfman kind of story was almost like the afterthought was like, hey, what other monsters can we look at? Stuff like kind of. I mean, I feel like that's more it than like necessarily something that kind of drove the production and stuff like that. It was more like kind of like we looked at these other monsters. What's another kind of seemingly what's called potential classic monster, I guess.
I mean, the only theme, and I'm very much sort of clutching at straws here, but the thing that I thought may have been connected is this idea of if you look at the story, this is about a guy who's coming back to his hometown and is then sort of turns into a monster and isn't really accepted in his home anymore. And I thought maybe this is kind of like maybe war veterans returning. We're talking 1941. Maybe this is an early kind of sort of take on that, although that's very much... It sounds plausible when I say it like that, but I don't know if that was really any kind of motivation for the movie.
I mean, if it is, then it's probably more just simply like instinct and not necessarily. I don't think it was like intentional because at that point, we're just into the thick of it. I mean, 1941 at that time, America was basically still out of the war. It wasn't until December 7th, of course, that like they finally kind of go, okay, we're in it also, like kind of. So I think like kind of because based on that, based on the timing of where America's stance was, they were very much like kind of like very much keeping it at bay. They were involved in that. They were running the blockades and stuff, like sending supplies over to Europe. They were trying to basically like hold the stance of like hey we're ready to act in the Pacific and stuff like that. But it was really just the Pearl Harbor, which we actually talked about in Midway, that kind of like triggered things for the country to mobilize.
I mean, I guess the other sort of underlying theme I can think of is sort of general masculinity, or if there's a rising of sort of feminism, and maybe this is kind of like seen as the man's place can be perceived as a monster in various settings. I mean, if you look at what actually happens, he starts by taking his dad's telescope and trying to sort of spy on the love interest through her bedroom window, and which is passed off as quite a sort of charming, roguish behavior. It wouldn't fly these days, but
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought also like it was interesting that Claude Rains, who we saw in Invisible Man, was the
Mm,
father and stuff.
that's
So it was
right.
kind of
Yeah.
a relatively, somewhat minor role and stuff like that. But then, of course, a much more major role in the remake, which is kind of interesting as well.
Yeah. Working his contract with Universal, no doubt. I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was the other obvious thing in this is that we have once again this idea of immigrants,
Yes.
passing around diseases or curses and things like this.
Yeah.
We have this band of traveling gypsies who are really the source of all the problems, really.
And Bela Lugosi coincidentally is called Bella the Gypsy in this one,
Yeah.
so he kind of fits right in with his foreign accent and yeah. So absolutely, it's this kind of idea of like like kind of these foreigners are always going to bring disease and pestilence and stuff.
Yeah. And have a nice sort of pentagram etched out on their
Right.
heads so that you can clearly identify that they're evil. So, yeah.
One thing that like I don't think is necessarily obvious, but we've talked before about us versus them. I feel
Mm.
like a key part about the story is this idea though that like we actually I guess we did talk about it in the thing is having like somebody who is among you that is the actual kind of
Yes.
monster or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess this is one of the. Well, I mean, yeah, I can't think of many other monster movies this early that introduces that sense of paranoia,
Yeah.
because the Mummy, okay, he's kind of in disguise a little bit, but you still pretty much know
Right.
who he is. It's always
Right.
fairly
Right.
obvious who he is. Dracula, you kind of know from the outset. He's almost
Hmm.
fairly blatant in it.
Yeah.
And
Both times, they're perceived as foreigners, and like we should not
yes,
trust them anyway.
yeah, exactly. The difference with this one is that this is someone from their own town
Mm,
who's come back, but is now
right.
this sort of hidden threat within a small town, which is, I mean, I guess yeah, you could look at it as kind of general sort of xenophobia as well, as kind of or this idea that if you go away and travel and come back, you'll be sort of changed in some sort of dangerous way or
Mm,
something like this. But you're right. It's the first. I mean, later on, obviously, we get things like Invasions of the Body Snatchers, but those
yes, I
until the
was gonna say.
50s and things like this. There isn't many others I can think of in the late 30s, early 40s is
Mhm.
really making paranoia a central component of the story.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot of relevance in terms of timing with like kind of historical events because of how you had these foreign wars going on and stuff, and there was
Mm,
discussions, like kind of and got more serious as the war kind of really kicked in for the U.S. of that like we might have spies among us and stuff. There was like
yeah,
kind of that paranoia that was starting to build, and then it kind of really brawled over after the war, even into the kind of McCarthyism and stuff, like you said, that the Invasion of Body Snatchers indirectly kind of alluded to and stuff.
yeah. It's interesting. It's almost like it's anticipating the fear of all these things. This movie, in a way. Yeah, and it's I mean, ultimately, it has it's got some romantic themes in it as well.
Oh
It's this
yeah.
idea of even though he's a charming, affable kind of guy, he's also this terrible monster.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one of the first movies where you're really sort of meant to sort of balance it out, whether you do like this character or not.
Right.
That's definitely not the case with the Mummy or Dracula,
Mm.
or maybe to some degree Frankenstein, for Victor Frankenstein, but certainly not the monster.
Right. Right.
So it's the first one where that really becomes a pretty central theme of.
That's true. Yeah. Evelyn Ankers plays Gwen Conliffe, and the character is kind of repeated in the remake and stuff, but kind of it's interesting how is they're very much dated to reflect the times because this one she's a little bit more independent, kind of more in fact she's engaged and so but she's like kind of like well I've known him all my life and like kind of so like kind of clearly on the one hand it's a marriage that like she's committed to, but the other, she has that kind of modern sensibility, like, kind of, like,
I'm open to
I,
offers.
I'm told, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the other thing where we bring in this kind of xenophobia, paranoia kind of element, because it's sort of like, okay, there's the man who she's engaged with and is well known, and here comes this stranger who's kind of slightly different and exotic, but he's also dangerous because he's a monster as well. So it's again, it's maybe this kind of thing of, and we've seen this in a few other movies of, oh, be careful who you start dating, because they might turn out to be something you don't like. Better just to play it safe, or it's the allure of it, it's the allure of something exotic, perhaps.
I mean, something we haven't talked about yet. At some point, I'm sure we will. But it's a lot of the Beauty and the Beast idea, where like kind of the male masculinity is as this kind of dangerous thing that needs to be tamed by. I guess we did talk a little bit about it in King Kong. It just this idea that, like, this kind of pure, innocent kind of love, like, kind of is needed to tame the beast and stuff.
Yeah, in a way, it's a kind of it's almost, you could almost view it as a spin on King Kong in a way, and that by having him just temporarily turn into a monster, you can you can explore the psychology of his character a little more.
That's true. I guess that's a huge difference, is the fact that, like, it's temporary, and, like, what's it called? Just as long as like, there's no full moon and stuff, they'll be all right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's funny because it's kind of, in an odd sort of way, when I think of moon cycles, you think of women's cycles, so to speak. So it's weird to have that kind of flipped on its head as a concept with the Wolfman, in that you've got men who are sort of like now having their lives run by a lunar cycle, which is kind of an interesting idea.
Speaking of which, I don't know if you've heard of, like, kind of the idea that, like, about how the lunar cycles affects people, and kind of like where twice a month people get a little crazy, like, like traffic accidents go up and all that kind of stuff.
Well, one of the fascinating things is, at the moment, I've been getting more into cryptocurrency, and I think John has a little bit as well. And one of the most interesting charts I've seen is this one of moon cycles and Bitcoin, where I think it's when there's a new moon or something like this, it's the bottom of a sort of a drop off, and it starts its new run up. And I'm not sure exactly if it's a full moon or a new moon or which one, but it's definitely like someone tried to make a correlation between that on a chart of peaks and troughs with Bitcoin.
Interesting.
So, I mean, in a way, it's something like cryptocurrency is based purely on psychology, because there's no real tangible goods that would be affected by supply chains or weather or anything else like that, really. So it's just the amount of speculation and faith in this, and lack of faith, we'll say, in other systems that are driving it. So people's psychology will obviously have a much bigger impact on it than other forms of commodities or equities. But yeah,
we see that probably more in the remake and stuff like that. That the idea that people treat it as a like basically a mental illness and stuff, right? And and I wonder, like, kind of about the roots of kind of like lycanthropy and stuff like that. Is it, like, kind of based on the fact that, like, people do act a little bit more weird during lunar cycles?
Yeah, I mean, it's whether you can actually interpret that as a actual mental illness and people turning into a monster will be a very extreme form of being affected by it. But it's obviously some sort of basis. I mean, I thought that was the real. I mean, okay, so 1941 version, it obviously ends fairly predictably, but to 2010, I guess this is quite a big jump in time. 50 odd years, and
that's true. Yeah,
and it's so the main key differences, I guess, would be that it's much more graphic. There's obviously a much gorier effort, and and this whole element of psychological trauma is really the central theme in this, rather than any sort of more vague and abstract notions of paranoia or xenophobia or sexuality and or gender and things like this.
And they chose to make it a period piece, which, like, it was an interesting choice. I mean, I think part of why was, we kind of talked about the kind of, the monster versus stuff like that. I think that's kind of where they were headed, to try to tie these different, things together. And then maybe, like, the next one, or the, future installments would be like a more modern Wolfman, because the disease apparently, or the curse, in terms of how it's framed, is maybe passed on to generations, or like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very strange movie, the 2010 version of Wolfman, because it's got a good cast. You've got Emily Blunt as Gwen. You've got Benicio Del Toro.
Sure.
You've got Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah.
Hugo Weaving. All kind of holding up the. These are all great actors, really, and it's done very realistically. It's got nice sets, expensive sets, and sort of injects some interesting themes of parental trauma, sort of childhood, reenacting on people and things like this.
Right.
But for some reason, it's just not that good a movie.
It hit, totally missed the mark. By the way, despite it bombing stuff, the makeup artist Rick Baker, who's known for monster makeup stuff, and the makeup effects supervisor, won Oscars for the makeup for that year.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, it is very good, actually, the makeup in it. And I mean, there was a few jump scares in it and things like this, sort of got me to twitch a little bit. And it was funny. It was just like I couldn't say that the actors weren't invested in the roles. I mean, Anthony Hopkins is pretty dislikable and quite psychopathic in his detachment from his own children, and the fact that he's kind of running this. Emily Blunt puts in a very kind of convincing.
I felt it was really heartfelt. Like, I felt like like she really she owned that role and stuff. Kind of out of all the different kind of the cast and stuff.
And Benicio Del Toro is like he acts like a kind of a slightly wounded animal in this whole movie, and seems sort of mysterious, but you do feel sorry for him as a character. And Hugo Weaving is just, he's Hugo Weaving, but he's still good.
It was Agent Smith in the steampunk era and stuff.
Yeah, but it's just weird, and it's just like you're watching it, and you're like, well, I kind of know what's going to happen, and I'm kind of bored by it. And I couldn't really understand why I was so bored by this movie.
Yeah, because of that. I think because you felt like you knew where things were headed and stuff, and it just, I don't know. It just seemed like overall there were really no surprises and stuff. I mean, the makeup in itself, kind of, that was a surprise, that how well it was done and all that. But in terms of the story, I just I kind of felt like we were just headed towards this tragic ending and stuff, and like that was it. Like, kind of like we kind of felt like we knew that, like, okay, we all know where this is going and stuff.
Yeah, it was strange. I there was lots of things that I was watching it, and I thought, this really should be better. I should be enjoying this movie more, but I'm not. But I mean, it's.
And I'll say that, like, from what I understand, it was a troubled production. I mean, like Joe Johnston, who actually is known for, like, Captain America, great movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and the Jumanji, which are entertaining in their own right, stuff like that, took over what was like really a struggling production and stuff like that. And I think that was the thing, like, when you already had a production that was kind of headed in the bad direction and stuff. I think it seemed like, anyways, that he salvaged things, but in the end, like, you can only do so much right with things.
Yeah, I think actually in a way, perhaps the problem with it is that Benicio del Toro almost feels a bit like an accessory to this movie. I didn't really feel like I got to know him as a character very much, really. I felt like Anthony Hopkins was front and center, and Emily Blunt was, but yeah, he was a bit too much in the background, I think, in a way. He was almost doing too good a job in this.
I also want to say that there was actually two versions. So I'm not sure which one you watched. Like, one version was where we're introduced to Emily Blunt's character with a voiceover and letter and stuff like that.
Oh,
And the other
okay.
one,
I didn't see
and
that one.
yeah, so that was actually the one I watched first,
Oh.
by accident. And then, like when I played on HDFY and stuff, I found out that she actually went to, I guess, London, and then found him at kind of performing and all that kind of stuff. And so it was interesting how they like it doesn't change a whole lot, but it changes the way you meet the two main characters and stuff, and the impressions. Like you have more of a sense that Lawrence, is kind of like a little bit of a well, not exactly the nicest guy and stuff like that. He's kind of very self-centered and all that kind of stuff, or at least like kind of very alienated from the family, but also like he, good amount of it is him doing it himself. Whereas the other one, I felt, just basically he's been alienated, but then the brother's death kind of pulls him into the rest of the story and stuff.
Yeah, the one I saw was the one where you see him backstage at the theater. So you do see him sort of living a somewhat debauched lifestyle.
Right. And so that's also like Gwen Conliffe initial impression of him and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting in the way that it uses Anthony Hopkins' character as the father, as this person who we, again, spoiler alert, we find out later on is kind of like the boss werewolf, and ends up sort of succumbing to his worst instincts by accidentally. You get the impression he accidentally killed his wife after this ill-fated trip to India, where he gets bitten, and again, a little bit more xenophobia thrown in there for for good measure. And he and then it seems like over time he actually accepts this part of his character and sort of embraces this slightly more psychopathic version of his character, to the point where he doesn't really give a shit about killing his kids anymore and things like this.
But he does at least have the wherewithal to kind of basically design this kind of cage, I guess, if you will, for himself, on those kind of moments or those nights when he can predict that he's going to be out of control, except for, I guess, apparently the times when he kills his son, and major spoilers always, and then other times, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting it's an interesting idea that you have all this power at your disposal, but also you don't want to get caught.
No.
So it's kind of, I mean, it is the kind of ego power trip that I'm sure psychopaths kind of toy with, this idea that, that's why I kind of think they leave clues and things like this, because it's kind of like, this was my choice ultimately. It was my choice to take this power and do something terrible with it. It's not something purely accidental, and that's what they sort of portray, and that he just kind of doesn't lock himself in on those nights when he wants to go out and kill people and be a badass. So which of course is different from, and they frame this at the end with this whole thing of where does the man end and the monster begin, and you kind of see this with Lawrence, in that he doesn't really know what he's doing. It's a sort of an unconscious violence that he inflicts on people, but ultimately something he'd rather not do.
Right. It's, if anything, it's this kind of family curse, right? That he's kind of given without any kind of real choice. And I guess that's the thing of, maybe like the connection to like a bigger ideas that sometimes, from my background working with small businesses and stuff, sometimes a family business is kind of like, family curse that is passed on, like for some people, because they're basically like, for sometimes the kids that it's like kind of something, like their explanation of like kind of why, like they're just kind of plodding along. They're not really, caring about the business thriving or succeeding and stuff. Like, well, this is just kind of like the thing I was born into and stuff. And so in some ways it's like a curse.
Yeah, you always see that in those movies where the the next generation, they have some great ideas to try and expand the business, and the dad's there
Right.
going, no, I know all about shoes, and you can't do this in the shoe market. There's nothing here. So
So they just
yeah,
give up,
it's
they're kind of like,
yeah.
okay, like kind of whatever then. And then they just kind of over the years, like kind of become more and more, less and less idealistic and more jaded as to what it means to be in the business and stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. I almost think in those kind of scenarios, you're better off having someone who's sort of outside the business, who actually learns and actually has probably a lot more respect for the lessons learned by the original owner, who probably
Yeah.
then goes and spins it off and does something more adventurous on their own, having learned a lot of those lessons that they got from the original owner. If you look at sort of various artisans, like sort of shoemakers and shirt makers and things like this, a lot of the time they'll do this. They'll go and learn from a very, very traditional thing, learn the craft inside and out, and then kind of rearrange it and remix it and do it in their own way, and still keep a lot of the quality and the craftsmanship, but just do it with very different, some avant-garde designs or something else. So, yeah. But unfortunately, poor Lawrence does not have the ability to do this. It's not like
No.
he can learn to become an all singing and dancing, stage performing werewolf, or
Right.
being a sensitive, loving werewolf to Gwen in this one.
And it's interesting that they chose acting right as the thing that he chooses to do and stuff.
Yeah, that was a really interesting choice, actually, because obviously you've got this character who, as we learn out, has seen his father as a wolf, who has
Right.
sort of bitten the neck out of his mother at some point in his childhood and sort of stashed it away in his unconscious. Um,
And his father, like kind of as he says at one point, like oh, you'll find that I'm quite the actor as well and stuff. Like kind of
yeah.
because there was that moment when the men are kind of confronting them and ready to kind of take Lawrence away the first time, and he kind of turns them away. And he puts on this act of like, oh, saying the manservant or whatever is ready to kind of fire down on you and kind of wipe you all out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And of course, Singh was, as he reveals, is like kind of like, oh, he's actually, like when he comes back, we'll talk to him or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to this point of, and I think that's one of those interesting things. And I can't remember who. I think I watched like Samuel L. Jackson's masterclass or someone, or it was one of the masterclass sort of things on acting, and they basically said, fundamentally, you have to remember that acting is just lying. You're basically just lying in a way in a controlled environment.
Right.
So the better you are at lying, really, the better you're going to be at acting. So
yeah. And another kind of funny connection to me is that as we were talking about the idea of a family business and something that's passed down and stuff, I started thinking about like kind of more recently The Sopranos, but then also like Godfather, like kind of where Michael Corleone is basically sucked into this family business, right? That like he initially is resistant and kind of doesn't want any part of and stuff, but the curse is that like well, actually you've been in it all along, and this is like now this is like, for better or worse, it's your inheritance.
Yeah. And what do you do with it when you get it? That's always the choice as well. I think they and the other thing in this is this idea, like you mentioned, actually, how we even got onto the remake, is this idea of sort of mental illness.
Oh, right.
And where that actually sort of comes in, because in this one, very different thing. We have them going to an asylum and them basically
pretty graphic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of injecting and dunking in ice water and things.
It's similar to we saw that with the Dracula, where they kind of like did more. They emphasize that more of like the just like kind of the modern, quote unquote. When I say modern, this is like I guess is this Victorian or Elizabethan? I guess
wouldn't be Elizabethan.
Victorian, I guess.
Victorian, Edwardian kind of era, I guess. That kind of thing, I would have thought. I suppose if it was Edwardian, you might be starting to get cars, so I guess more Victorian then.
Okay. So, where they're showing like kind of, these kind of methods, I guess, for that time period of just kind of, I mean, it seems like that it's not that far removed from torture,
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of thing where they're often portrayed in older, especially horror movies that are around about asylums or mental treatment. The idea is that it was so sort of primitive that it was no different from torture, and that also it sort of heightens this idea that you must kind of conform to the society at the time, otherwise you'll basically kind of be put in this torturous place where it's almost worse than prison, because they'll do some cruel and unusual things by dunking you and injecting you and all sorts of things like this. So it's this idea that you can't I get maybe the point in this is that they're trying to say you can't necessarily express all your inner demons without being persecuted either way. You either sort of do it in a physical sense as the werewolf, or you try and if you try and talk to a doctor, you'll get tortured. And really, it's only Gwen's final scene where she sort of says, "Hey, you know me, and don't be like this," that she even sort of brings him to some kind of form of sense at that time. And then goes and shoots him. But
yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like a funny, or I'm not funny, but like ironic at least, that like it's almost like what we're saying is that like in the end, at least in that time period, the only resolution for people that are that different, or like kind of I mean, granted, this is a monster movie, so but like I feel like metaphorically it's saying that like that the only kind of real path in the end, or ultimate demise and stuff like that, is going to be death for like kind of anybody who's a deviant and stuff.
Yeah. The other thing that's quite interesting in this one, and this is sort of actually echoed in the original as well, is this idea, if you the father says, "Oh, I used to be a bare knuckle boxer in Boston," or something like this. So he's in, you would have thought if he was someone who was bare knuckle fighting on the docks in Boston, he probably wasn't very wealthy at that point, but he somehow accrued all this wealth, and is now, has this big manor house and, all this land and stuff. And it kind of implies that it was perhaps his inner psychopathy that kind of got him to where he is, and this is part of his nature that's just amplified by him becoming a werewolf. But there's this kind of in the original, it's almost like there's a mistrust of people in elite status or with elite status, because if you notice, all the townspeople kind of turn on the family of that household when they start thinking it might be him, and that's the other thing is. This whole thing of can you really trust these people with power and wealth, I think is more the question in the original. In this one, it's almost a question that it's almost this point that power, absolute power corrupts absolutely kind of thing, where this guy has become really powerful and is now just just doing whatever the hell he wants, including killing members of his, I guess, kind of like a Roman emperor kind
of. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point though, about how like there's this kind of theme of like mistrust of, like you said, the power that goes with wealth and stuff. I thought that was funny how Anthony Hopkins, like his character, like refers to the son as the prodigal son again and again and stuff.
Yes, right, yeah.
And part of the key element of the prodigal son is this idea, like kind of like the initial thing of like is the son that kind of basically branches off, like taking all this different wealth and stuff, but then ends up poor and then coming back and stuff. Almost like hat in hand and stuff.
Yeah, that's very much. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that being a struggling actor is a very easy way to kind of portray that in a movie. Yeah. Yeah, and he seems like the kind of the failed son, or the son that he's not particularly keen on in this one. And he describes him as the frail one, and he's almost like he preferred the older brother so much that that's why he killed him, so that he couldn't leave in a way. But he was fine to let the younger one leave.
I was gonna say that definitely is also another key aspect of the prodigal son parable, is how the other son is the one that isn't frivolous and kind of is hardworking and is favored in some ways. But when the prodigal son comes back, what's called yeah, granted you turned away, but you're still always been my son. And in other words, almost like still not quite favoring, but still like kind of um, still willing to kind of lavish more onto this other son and stuff that kind of went away and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way, you can sort of see the original as this idea that, if you go away, there's parts of your character that are too sort of deviant from what your family has raised you at or what the society will accept you as. Whereas in the remake, it seems like there's certain traits from your father or family that you can't escape and you're going to sort of
Right.
get embroiled into. So it's different ways of expressing this monstrous behavior into different movies.
And definitely like a key part about it like is with almost like kind of within the curse is the idea that like there's all these kind of secrets and deceptions and stuff, and like I said, it's part of the acting, but it's also like kind of where that's kind of how like things kind of almost um, I don't know, fester, or kind of like this that's kind of just gets worse, I guess, with time.
And that's a theme we see in Stephen King over and over again. It's this
Oh,
idea that
right.
with a small town and a contained area or a family that keeps secrets, these
Uh-huh.
kind of dysfunctions and various sort of, horrible behaviors are allowed to persist for many, many years, and they
Right.
become accepted as part of the town or the family as this is just how it works. So yeah, I mean, if dad goes and locks himself in a cage every full moon, that's just how things work in this family. So
Yeah. Yeah, because certainly, saying the servant was a key part of like kind of preserving that secret and stuff.
yeah.
And because he, like when Lawrence kind of approaches him and talks about like kind of like, oh, so you hunt monsters also and stuff like that, and kind of like, I mean, there's not even a hint of a nod or kind of like smile or anything like that. He's basically like, I'm not saying a thing and stuff.
Mm. You would have thought, though, as of course poor old Singh does
Uh-huh.
get killed, you would have thought he would, if I was Singh, I would pretty much have a handgun with some silver bullets on me pretty much at all times, If I'm like in control of a werewolf that's already killed his wife that he was in love with, and you as the
Right.
person, as an employee, I would definitely be, yeah.
Yeah, it's what's it called, unfortunate that he didn't think of that, and I don't know, like, and well, I guess it's probably not much point in getting the kind of the finer details of kind of how the ending kind of goes, or the twist, I guess, and part of
Mm.
the ending. Um, I think it's no secret that like it's a tragic ending and stuff like that, but yeah, the whole silver bullets thing with saying and all that, that I found really questionable, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Mind you, we did get a good kind of like werewolf fight in a
Yeah.
room.
Oh
That
yeah.
was, it's okay. So, any more final thoughts on the remake? I guess
um.
it tried. It certainly was ambitious. It tried to do
Yeah.
lots of
Yeah.
things, but somehow it just, yeah, it's funny. It's one of those ones that I'm really racking my brains over as to why it's not very exciting. But I will probably come back to it at some point, I suppose, and figure it out.
Just no surprises. Like kind of. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a pretty straightforward story. Like, I mean, the surprises were the effects and kind of
Yeah.
how kind of well it was done and stuff. I mean, some of the parts were pretty ghastly in terms of the effects and stuff, and so
Mhm.
I thought that was great. But then that's just not enough. I mean, that's
No.
the bottom line.
I mean, I think that's where, say, something like American Werewolf in London succeeds as a movie.
Yeah.
There are a lot of surprises in that. You
Yeah.
have this whole idea of your friend coming back who's haunting you with, as an extra part of the curse. You've got, these weird
The
dream
humor.
sequences and the humor as well, which is
Yeah.
really does sort of. I mean, it's a really interesting balance of scary frights
Yeah.
and humor. American Werewolf in London, but yeah,
I think that's the thing that like sometimes if you try to take yourself too seriously, because like it seemed like like there was clearly the tragedy and clearly like with Emily Blunt, you had the sense of that, like
mm,
she really kind of carries across that, but it just all kind of just heavy, and like I think the American Werewolf in London, we knew that there was this tragedy and stuff like that, so the surprise was the humor and like kind of that kind of like really helped to like make it where it's almost more tragic, and also made it where it's just more interesting.
Yeah, and I think as well the key difference is that the problem is, you see, like studio executives in Hollywood know that, oh yeah, American Werewolf in London was good because it had humorous elements and it had horror elements. Okay,
Right.
So they then try and crowbar in humor into horror movies at random intervals to say, oh, that's what we need to do because this was successful before. Whereas the humor actually seems sort of effortless in American Werewolf in London, or it seems sort of intentional as part of the main sort of storytelling, which it doesn't often when they try and do it in other ways. But yeah,
right. Yeah, if anything, we saw that with the Mummy, where like they tried to force in the humor, and it just fell flat. And I think that's probably, if they had done something like that, then this movie wouldn't be even as like kind of I would put this a cut above the Mummy because
I would as
like
well, actually, yeah.
Okay, because it was overall like kind of very sincere, very kind of I mean, there's not much that you can kind of really say is like, oh, that's kind of really garbage, whatever, it's like that. But there's just nothing was about it that really shined either.
Yeah. So here's a question for you then.
Sure.
So obviously, which well, first of all, which do you prefer, the 1941 or the 2010?
I would have to say the 41, just because of how like it's such a classic, and that like I would say that it was surprises per se, but it just was more engaging, like kind of because
it was actually. You're right.
Yeah,
it's got a shorter running time, but also it's really the key sort of chemistry between Gwen and Larry in that one that actually keeps you watching. It's pretty. It's funny. It's far more engaging the 2010 version just for that fact alone, even though the effects are kind of silly. But
sure.
But yeah. So then I'll ask you this: which of the, let's say, the newest remakes of the monster remakes, how would you rank those? So let's start with, what's the most recent Dracula that we looked at?
So I would say the last one we looked at was the one, the Bram Stoker's by Francis Ford Coppola, right? I thought that was the last one.
Oh, that was okay. So we're not really we're still in the 90s. We haven't got into
the
that's 2000s plus. Yeah. I mean, I guess there was ones like Dracula Untold and things like that. Okay. Oh, we kind of messed up there then. All right. Well, let's move on to the Mummy then. So we've got the Mummy with Tom Cruise. That was one of the newest ones we had. Frankenstein, the 2015 one with Carrie-Anne Moss.
Right.
The Invisible Man, I guess. Well, we had the remake with
Elizabeth Moss.
And
that was the most contemporary out of all the different ones. Yeah.
And then we've got this one with the Wolfman from 2010. I guess those are all the most, within the last 10, 15 years, roughly.
Right.
So how would you rank those in terms of 1 to 4?
I mean, I just based on just pure, not necessarily monster, but just pure watchability and movie and stuff like that, I felt that The Invisible Man was definitely like the one that, was like, if you didn't know that it was a monster movie, I thought that like it's just the most watchable, I felt.
Yeah.
And then like, kind of backtracking a little bit more, probably the most, I don't know how you describe it, but Bram Stoker's Dracula, I felt like was kind of like the most pure horror that like was, I know about the, like kind of what we talked about, the English accents, all that kind of stuff, but I felt like just visually though, as we talked about as well, it's just also just so watchable, just for the pure experience of like kind of this horror movie that like was so cinematic and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not really a kind of apples to apples comparison. We really need a 2000s Dracula to compare it to, but of course then it wouldn't be as good. So yeah, definitely Bram Stoker's would be that choice. But yeah, I would agree. I think of the more recent ones, the Invisible Man remake was just a really engaging thriller.
That you almost didn't think of it as a monster movie or anything like that.
Yeah, but there was, I mean, I really think like the horrific elements, like when her friend gets, who is it?
Oh
Somebody
yeah,
gets killed in the restaurant.
that
That
was
was
still
really
one.
shocking, actually.
That was still one of the most memorable movie moments I say in a while and stuff.
Yeah. Then I would say actually, even though it's a bit off, off the beaten path, but I actually
Right.
really like the 2015 Frankenstein remake. That
Okay.
would probably be
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
second pick, just
Yeah.
because it's such a weird movie and
Yeah.
really
I agree.
it's one of those ones I feel like I will probably watch again at some stage and just sort of see
Okay.
if I can get my head around it a little more. And then after that, well, then I would say it's probably Wolfman for me, and then The
Okay.
Mummy with Tom Cruise right at the bottom.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, kind of related to our early discussion stuff, what would you like? What do you feel like is going to be the next thing that is
The
almost like
next thing.
that we're doomed, I guess, is to experience with the remakes?
Yes, what will they do? I mean, I wonder. I think what will probably happen is Marvel seems to be on a kind of a downtrend at the moment,
Okay.
and I wonder if that will that'll sort of dissuade studios from trying to create mega franchises. I may not, but I'm hoping in a way that we won't see like a MonsterVerse or something like that. I think just some more interesting takes on them. They're ripe for. It's one of the few things I can watch and I can say, okay, I'd quite happily watch another remake of this at some stage in the future with a new spin on it and a new concept. I think all of those original Universal monsters have enough in them that you can do stuff with them in different ways.
I think what they've tried to do is kind of do almost like these superhero monsters, like kind of like not even like Blade, but like they tried to do something with I forget his name, but like the I Frankenstein like kind of thing, and that I felt like didn't really fly. Like yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've had quite a few superhero Draculas. Blade is basically kind of superhero Dracula. Mobius, which is coming out soon, is yet another sort of hero vampire, anti-hero sort of vampire. No, I think just I could go with another remake, but just something that sort of looks at it from a more interesting psychological angle, probably. But I certainly don't need a team of superhero universal monsters with Frankenstein and Dracula,
right.
the Invisible Man,
Oh man,
teaming up.
Oh, please don't,
because I mean, the one thing that would always fail with that is that they will have very different kind of powers or abilities, because the stories are about fundamentally different themes.
Right.
The Invisible Man is never going to be very useful, although I think he is in like the Doom Patrol or there's other TV shows that incorporate him, but
it didn't last very long though.
I don't know. I didn't watch it actually. But,
okay.
But no superhero team ups. Don't need that. I think just more actual out and out horror movies that explore some of this stuff would be good for me. So I guess now we've had a pretty monstrous few months here.
Yes.
So we're going to move on to something lighter soon.
Well, coming into the holiday season, so certainly we'll be looking into that.
One we'll be looking at, of course, is Home Alone versus Home Sweet Home Alone, the new Disney Plus version, which I've been unfortunate enough to watch at least 4 times now, because for some reason my daughter now loves it. Yeah, my daughter loves this movie for some reason.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That actually says a lot.
It's weird, actually. It's sort of actually, I hate to say it, but it's actually, there's a few bits that I ignored the first time and now finding quite funny. So
it's growing on you. Huh?
Yeah.
Like a fungus.
I know, right? We got Nightmare on Elm Street next week.
Yes.
And
will Cindy possibly be joining us again?
Maybe.
Okay.
I can't remember what else. We got one more, I think, before the new year, but yeah, that's where we're at.
Sounds good. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you at the movies.